This is a Momentum Media production.
The SMSF Adviser Show, your expert insights into the biggest themes shaping the SMSF advice industry.
Hello and welcome to the SMSF Adviser Show. I'm your host, Keith Ford, joined as always by Aaron Dunn, who is currently in Brisbane for the BGL Red Tech event. How are you, Aaron?
Very good, Keith. Yes, so much warmer and sunnier up here than it is in Melbourne. So great. We did actually try to record this yesterday whilst we were together in Sydney, but alas, we had some technical issues. But it was, these are great events to obviously be a part of, and getting some insight, obviously, from a technology point of view and catch up with clients and so forth. So a lot of fun.
That's right. It would have been great to record in person, but alas, it was not to be, unfortunately.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, as is always the way, we sort of kick off the SMSF Adviser Show with what's making news. So I'm going to hand over to you.
Right. So the first piece of news, as it has been in the news for many, months at this point, the $3 million cap. This time looking, I guess, at the implications of taking money out of your super in order to stay below that threshold for the tax concessions, whether it's a good thing, whether it's maybe something you should reconsider. There's been a bit of talk around it. I know one of the people mentioning it was Meg Heffron from Heffron, who was speaking at the SMSF Association Technical Summit last week on the Gold Coast, and just, brought up the idea of, some people looking at getting it below that threshold and whether that's a good idea.
Yeah, so naturally at that SMSF Association Technical Summit, there was a lot of discussion about the proposed impact of those measures. I think Peter Burgess also made some comments at that event about the fact that, draft legislation is pending, and therefore we are hopefully then going to get some better guidance about, how these rules are going to work. But Meg, really spoke to some of the ways in which we are likely to expect. And I think advisors are already having conversations with their clients about what the alternatives look like. So do you actually keep this money inside superannuation, and there's a tax impost that's going to be incurred in respect to the earnings? And we've debated the way in which that's operating and whether that's the right way going forward and so forth. But the alternatives that are there, and what are the considerations for different people based upon different assets and different values and so forth as well. So there's a lot of those clients, I think Meg touched on it, they've had no capacity to be able to make contributions for some time because, they're well above the what is now 1.9 million. But, so we're talking about balances at 3 million. So therefore it's the way in which their balance is going to look going forward. And therefore the argument is, well, should it be kept in super, or do we look at alternate structures? And ultimately it's going to come down to the devil that we see in the detail, and things like whether unrealized gains are going to form part of the final legislation or not. And those are all crucial decisions that advisors will need to get clarity on before they really push the button with some of the clients.
Absolutely. And it's also moving from all being at the 15% to some being at the 30%. And, you've still got to, if you're wanting to move it out of the super, you have to find something that's going to be more advantageous than that 30% anyway.
Yeah. So it's a modeling. It then does become a genuine modeling thing to say, well, you need to consider the alternate structures as to where that money would be at, and therefore determine that would be a better outcome in that scenario. And again, until we get any sort of reference points from a draft legislation point of view, and even once we get into draft, there's going to be consultation, and then it will go into Parliament. And then it'll go obviously through the House of Reps fairly quickly, but then it will go to the Senate, and no doubt it will go into Senate committees, and there will be jockeying for position of, the SMSF Association and others to really highlight some of these key issues around the unrealized gains. And so there's a lot of water to still go under the bridge on this thing. So, we remain fingers crossed that we get the outcomes that we need to, but equally there are conversations that are happening right now about what things might have to look like in the future with your existing clients that have balances over and or near that figure.
Yeah. And as you mentioned, the unrealized gains. That was kind of what Peter Burgess was not bringing up, but reiterating. The SMSF Association has been on that for quite a while, that taxing of the unrealized capital gains opens up a real can of worms, makes things a bit tough. But at the same time, as is something that Meg Heffron mentioned, was that at the moment, as you say, there's a long way to go before this is actually legislated and in place and we know the details. And so even if you are considering changes, it's probably best to wait until we know exactly what it's going to look like before you make any moves, would probably be a, general idea.
Yeah, absolutely. So, if you think about this as a marathon, I mean, we're not really even in it, we're still within the first 5Ks.
That's it. It's early doors. The wheels of government turn slowly.
Yes.
Also on the government regulation side, we had Michelle Levy, who obviously was the lead reviewer of the Quality of Advice Review. She also speaking at the SMSF Association Technical Summit. She brought up her thoughts around the best interest duty. Obviously, her mooted replacement for the best interest duty was a good advice duty, with her essentially wanting the removal of the best interests, as she thinks it's a bit of muddled legislation. Obviously, the government has not committed to bringing good advice yet. It has committed to removing the safe harbor steps from the best interest duty. And basically, the crux of what Miss Levy was saying, herself being a lawyer, so understanding the legislative side of these things quite well, was that removing the safe harbor steps will not affect how courts look at these, whether you've implemented the best interest duty correctly. It will still use the precedent from previous actions to look at what's happened and whether you've hit the marks that you need to, and essentially without completely redrafting the best interest duty, nothing will actually in practice change just from removal of safe harbor.
Yeah. And I mean, you've absolutely nailed it on the head there, Keith, because, the reality is there are, the government's carved this out into 3 areas, and they're really trying to focus on some of the quick wins and so forth. But there are some inherent problems ultimately that Michelle has raised by actually partitioning some of these elements, and this whole area of best interest duty with the safe harbor and stuff. As you rightly said, when we see it, there are sort of common law issues there already at play, and the way in which a court will look at these things, unless we see an entire physical change in the law, then we're going to look at precedent in determining, outcomes from this. So I think it would be fair to say there's an element of frustration from the work that she's done and the way in which the government's approaching it. How that all plays out, again, we'll just need to wait and see.
That's it. And one of the quotes, the wording of it's quite interesting, is when she's talking about how the law will be interpreted by the court. She says that, you can't come along and look at what a government does after the fact. I think it's always going to be infected by that whole safe harbor step when it's being interpreted. I think that infected wording is quite interesting, and that it's already had all these years of being implemented, and it's tough to just get rid of that completely in the eyes of the courts.
Yeah. And again, unless we see a complete drafting of it out, then obviously you have precedent with these things. And as we've sort of already raised, that's the way that the courts will look at these particular issues until such a time that has kind of, moved 180 degrees. And I think, again, that's some of the concerns that Michelle's had is the petitioning into, a do now, we'll do later, and then we might do. She put all these recommendations together for good reason. And therefore, a lot of these sort of things also intertwine. And if we're not kind of taking a holistic approach to the recommendations, then potentially we come up with some issues that she's naturally raised last week at that SMSF Technical Summit.
Absolutely. And of course, there's many people have a lot of problems with many of the different recommendations from Miss Levy, but the way that she put it together, the idea, as you said, was it's a package. And if you don't change the best interest part, some of the other changes then don't make sense within this. Correct. And so it just kind of needs to be all wrapped up in, and that's her opinion, of course. And, everyone can make their own opinions on how that works. But the idea of how she laid it out was for it to be that whole package. But
yep. Yeah, absolutely.
Another little piece of news, a very large number is kind of the crux of the next story. Essentially, there's potentially around 100,000 directors of SMSF corporate trustees that still do not have a director ID based on some ATO figures. Obviously, the director ID laws changed. I'm not actually sure when that changed. But
April. Well, it was April. I think it was the 4th or 5th of April last year that it was a mandated requirement. And then we had transitional arrangements in essence through to November 2020. I'm trying to test myself here. So November 2022 and then a transitional piece through to April. So, so I'm assuming here that the representation is those that needed to get it in the transitional period as opposed to those that should be now getting it prior to being appointed as a director of a company.
That's right. And the deadline has in fact passed, is part of this.
Quite a while ago.
However, directors can still apply, which is, I guess, a good thing if you have not done so yet. The idea is that the Business Registry Service is trying to take a reasonable approach. Someone from the ATO is quoted in this story. And basically, if the directors are trying to do the right thing, then they'll be allowed to continue with their application process now. But obviously, that's a big number of people that have not done so yet.
Yeah, and I think that'll be a combination of people that just genuinely haven't done it. And I've heard of stories of people just flatly refusing to do it because of their beliefs with government. And we won't sort of go down that path. But, there are others that have gone through wind up processes and maybe they haven't wound it up and their intention is that they'd never intend on getting it because their intention was to wind up by that time but they haven't done it. And then we see others, and we know that the ATO is still chasing a number of funds for outstanding work and even the risks that they've had in first year funds. And I think we were having a chat yesterday about this at the Sydney event where we see a number of funds that might have gone down a path of thinking they're going to set up a self-managed fund. For whatever reason that was, it hasn't worked out, whether it's been through fraudulent activity, investments that have gone bad or something, and they've just washed their hands of it. And ultimately, that overflow of outstanding tax returns with those sort of funds that the ATO is chasing down means that they've just gone, well, I'm not interested in doing all this other stuff either. So I reckon you're going to have a fairly mixed bag in there. There is an acknowledgement of the role of education, of the need for a director ID. But what also sits within the legislation is around a $13,000 fine for not actually complying with the rules either.
Do not like the sound of getting a $13,000 fine, but who knows? Maybe that's just me.
Well, I think, but the reality is that you end up in a situation whereby education will play its role for a point in time, and then education switches over to enforcement. So It's the old carrot and stick.
Yeah, and I guess it is also an educational moment that it's setting up an SMSF is not something that should be taken lightly. It is a lot of work for people that are going to be involved in this kind of structure. And, if you're not able to get yourself a director ID, perhaps it wasn't a good idea to set the SMS up in the first place.
Yeah. Well, and I think, the most important part to this is that if you are setting up new SMSFs with clients and so forth as well, that there is a legislative obligation to obtain the director ID at least a day before the company is incorporated. So that is set out within the Corporations Act. So, there is a change in process that has occurred as a result of what I'd call a more digitized approach to establishing funds. If we think about director IDs and the requirements to get that and the interaction with MyGov and so forth, and then all the way through to the way in which documents can now be executed, which we've spoken about previously as well. So there is a process change that we're seeing, and therefore making sure that professionals and then clients are up to date with what needs to be done and when it needs to be done and how it can be done is really important.
Absolutely. And so we're just going to take a quick break now. When we come back, we'll have an interview with Lyn Formica, who's the head of education and content at Heffron. We're going to be talking about ways that you can keep on top of regulatory changes. All right, and welcome back. We've now got Lyn Formica with us. She's the head of content and education at Heffron, which is an SMSF consultancy. Welcome, Lyn.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Not a problem. Before we jump into all of the kind of hard-hitting questions, what we might start with is, would you just be able to give us a bit of a rundown on exactly what Heffron does and how it helps SMSF advisors?
Excellent. Yeah. So essentially, Heffron's all about raising standards in the SMSF industry. So we look after the administration of self-managed super funds. We have about 5,000 of those. We also provide education and support to SMSF professionals, whether they're advisors, accountants, auditors, looking after self-managed superannuation funds. And of course, Meg's an actuary as well.
Right. Always good to have someone like that in the business.
That's right.
So how do you see recent market developments impacting, I guess, the relevance of SMSFs in the current landscape?
Oh, look, when I'm having conversations with professionals at the moment, the thing that's usually front of mind is the government's $3 million cap, or the proposed $3 million cap, that proposed change, which is effectively, going to increase the earnings for members with large balances. It's caused some in the industry to question the relevance or the future of self-managed superannuation funds. Because as we understand it, a large number of the people who have self-managed super funds will be impacted. A large number of the people who will be impacted have self-managed superannuation funds.
Yeah, a lot more in the SMSF space than like in the retail or industry funds.
That's right, exactly. But I think if the $3 million cap is causing us to question the future of an SMSF, one, it's sort of assuming that our immediate reaction to the proposal is that we're going to withdraw all our money out of super, if we're eligible to, of course. Meg Heffron's done some great modelling around the pros and cons of that in connection with the $3 million cap. And essentially, whether it's a good idea or not, it depends. For some people, it will be a good idea. For some people, it won't. Number of variables, but none of that modelling suggests that people should be withdrawing all of their superannuation immediately. So certainly, you're still going to have balances in self-managed super funds. And I think if we're questioning the relevance of self-managed super funds, then you're assuming that the majority of the members of self-managed super funds have more than $3 million in super. And we looked at our client base. I don't know what the statistics are across the industry, but looking at our client base, it's 5,000 funds. It's a good sample size. Less than 10% of them have more than $3 million in super. 65% of them have less than $1 million in super. So, they obviously think that a self-managed superannuation fund is the right thing for them, even though they've got money well short of that $3 million threshold. So I really don't think the $3 million threshold is going to have a big impact on the future of self-managed super funds. I think if anything's going to have an impact, it's things, government proposing change like that. People don't like change. People don't like change they don't understand. And I think as an industry, the message we need to get across is that, despite the fact that governments of every flavour like to tinker with the superannuation system, compulsory super, voluntary super, it does play a really important role in our retirement income system. So we need to get that message of, change is okay in super. We just need to make sure that we understand it.
Yeah, and I suppose like 10%, as you mentioned, having over 3 million, that's a small part of your client base. It is a larger proportion than, the APRA regulated side of things, of course.
Correct.
But also, I suppose, in a general sense, if you're looking at taking anything above that 3 million threshold out of the super fund, you do have to then find something that's going to be more advantageous from a tax structure wise than the 30% it'll go to instead of the 15. So it's not like you're just not allowed to have more than 3 million. You do then have to weigh the risks and benefits of whether it is actually going to be more beneficial outside of super.
Absolutely. And we can't even just think about tax. I mean, tax is obviously the first thing we go to in terms of this is a tax change. What's another better tax structure for me? But I might find that taking outside super throws all my estate plans in the bin.
Right.
I might have had better control over my super from an estate planning perspective where it was than in a family trust or something like that. So a lot of thinking to do, I think, between now and 2026. Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of people figuring out all sorts of different structures to put things in.
Yes.
So aside from the $3 million cap, which obviously, as you mentioned, huge deal and a lot of people very interested in it, especially in the SMSF space, what are some of the other kind of more recent regulatory updates that professionals in the SMSF industry just need to stay informed about?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple that are front of mind. Non-arm's length income and expenses is certainly, continuing to rear its ugly head. We were all hopeful that the government in the May budget would have repealed the changes that were put in back in 2018. But that wasn't to be. So, we've had some small concessions around the amount of fund income that could potentially be taxed at the 45%. We've still got this really draconian system that's in place at the moment. Now we've even got one rule for SMSFs and one rule for non-SMSFs. And so I think staying on top of where that is, because it is still a moving feast. I think we have a exposure draft that's out there. Lots and lots of people still lobbying. So certainly one area to definitely stay on top of.
Yeah, and I know that exposure draft has caused a bit of controversy, a lot of discussion, a lot of people. As you said, that two-system thing where between the 3 million cap and the gnarly stuff, it's a bit of inconsistent messaging from the government about whether we're staying consistent with between the two systems or not.
Exactly. It was, the consultation around the $3 million cap was very much, we want one system that works for everyone. We can't have differences between SMSFs and non-SMSFs. And then we end up with a non-arm's length income exposure draft and all the rest of it having significant differences between SMSFs and non-SMSFs. And, to tell you the truth, I still can't understand where the mischief is here. I don't understand what they think SMSFs are doing that warrants this draconian rules. Yeah.
Yeah, that idea of, now the gnarly being able to affect all of the CGT instead of just that's connected to it. It is a big departure from how it's kind of been operating previously. So,
yeah, that's right. And I think if something has gone wrong, it's not because an SMSF trustee was deliberately trying to manipulate the rules. They just didn't know they were required to charge their fund a fee for X. Or, there's one rule that says that they can't charge a fee for their trustee services. There's another rule, we've got gnarly that says, no, you should be charging a fee. Anything, your any services you're providing to the fund. I can understand their confusion. And, we're talking about such minor impacts here. I've never, I've spent 30 years working in super. I've never seen anyone manipulating the rules deliberately, not paying for services, not paying for the things they provide to their fund to get a better tax result. It doesn't feel common sense to charge your fund a fee for the fencing you just put in. Like it's just, it's a very strange right. System. Yeah.
Yeah. And I guess that desire for clarity kind of brings me to my next question, which is just how and what methods can accountants, advisors, trustees, what methods can they employ to ensure that they remain well informed about these regulatory updates with everything that changes with SMSFs?
Yeah, look, I think we're really fortunate that, experienced professionals do have a wide range of resources to keep themselves up to date. There's many of us in the industry who provide, update webinars. You've got your podcasts, blogs, and there's daily email alerts keeping you up to date. You can join your industry associations discussion group, those sorts of things. So there's lots out there. I think I just really get the message across that take up what's out there, take advantage of it all. Regulation of super and SMSFs is a complex area. Things do change, but it's a lot easier if you stay up to date. So, be that sponge, absorb everything that's out there. Even if something isn't instantly relevant to you, park it in the back of the brain because you don't know the next client who may have that particular issue to deal with, and that information will be useful for you. I think we're in a stage of, everyone's time poor these days, and often we put education on the back burner. I don't have time to stay up to date, those sorts of things. So if that's your issue, I think you're trying to find bite-sized micro courses, something that you can delve into instantly. If you've got, for example, you're dealing with a client issue, they've got business real property, they're leasing to a related party, you just want to know how it works. You don't want to sit through a day's course on the investment rules for SMSFs. You don't even want to do a half-day course on in-house asset rules. You just want a little bite-sized micro course that, in 30 to 45 minutes can tell you exactly what you need to know to move on, deal with that client issue, and move on to the next client problem. So I think we have all of those resources in the industry. We just need to make sure that we're using them. I think where we've got a gap, I feel for the SMSF trustees. I think we really have a gap in the market in terms of educating our SMSF trustees. Often when I see a trustee who's come unstuck, they just didn't understand the rules. There are obviously an element who like to push the edges, push the envelope, but most trustees just didn't understand the rules. I remember Justin McHale from the ATO once saying, we don't start to drive a car without first understanding the road rules. And SMSFs are no different. Running an SMSF is no different. So SMSF trustees need to have a good understanding of the rules to, first to set themselves up for success. So I think as an industry, we need to get some more resources out there for SMSF trustees to take advantage of.
Yeah, and I suppose leaning on professionals that really understand what they're doing, of course, has to help.
Oh, exactly. So the professional makes sure they stay up to date, make sure that they can understand it well enough to be able to provide a practical answer to clients, so we don't end up with too confused people.
That's right, because it is such a complex area of, legislation, of tax structures. It's very complicated, so it's not something to take on lightly, I guess.
No. But as I said, it's just making sure that you keep following along. And I'd hate to take a 12-month break out of the industry at the moment. I think it's going to be really difficult for you to catch up. There's just so much that changes.
Yeah, you need to have like a Cliff Notes when you come back, and even maybe a 2-month holiday to Europe or something would be too much to catch up on.
Well, hopefully we can at least manage that.
That's right.
Yeah.
So, what do you think are some specific strategies that, might be a bit unique to SMSFs compared to the standard industry funds that people could use?
Ooh, where do I start? How long have we got? I mean, one tax strategy which is unique to self-managed super funds is that ability for an SMSF member to make a contribution in 1 year, claim a tax deduction for it in that year, but count it for contribution cap purposes in the following year. So, for example, a fund I was looking at yesterday, she made a contribution to her SMSF in mid-June, but the trustee decided to allocate that contribution to her in July. So the contribution was made in the 2023 financial year, eligible for deductibility in the 22-23 financial year, but counts towards 23-24 year contribution cap. Critical part of that strategy is that you've made that contribution in June, because we only have until the 28th day of the following month to allocate it. So to use next year's cap, I need to push it into next financial year. So I've got to make my contribution in June, then allocate it in the July. Keith, you might be thinking, why on earth would someone want to do that? It's essentially around tax. So this particular client had a large taxable income in 22-23. It was unusual. She'd made a large capital gain. She's not expecting to have the same sort of level of income next year. So she can get better value out of her tax deduction for her super contribution in that particular way. So get a tax deduction in 22-23 so that she doesn't exceed her contribution caps. We do it in that particular way so she uses up next year's cap this year. Now, that is unique to self-managed super funds. Not because self-managed super funds are doing it dodgy or anything. Essentially, we just have different laws. So super law says that SMSF trustees have until 28th day of the end of the month to allocate their contributions, whereas large funds have to allocate them in 3 days. So for them, it's impractical to offer that strategy. Yeah.
Right. You'd have to be doing it on the June 30 and
yeah, it's just not going to work. You know how long it takes to get contributions into super funds these days. Yeah.
No, that definitely makes sense. And it is something, when you hear it, if it's something you've not heard before, it kind of just, wait, how does this work? Why would someone want to do this? But as you mentioned, that one-off CGT event makes it a viable strategy that really makes a lot of sense.
Well, exactly. It might be the large bonus, those sorts of things. Not suggesting people do it in every year, because you're forever having to remember that I've already made next year's contribution, those sorts of things. It's just that one-off situation where you've got a large spike in income, or maybe you are going to take that 12 months off next year. You're not going to have any income next year, so let's not waste next year's cap. We'll put our contributions in this year or something like that. A lot of people who I haven't heard of it, they think, well, it just smells a bit. They originally when people suggested it, it was like you were pretending you didn't know who the contribution was for. I'm not going to allocate it to Fred's account. I'm not sure who it's for yet. I'll wait till July. It's nothing like that. We know exactly who the contribution's for. It's a legitimate tax strategy. We don't need to allocate it. So we'll choose to not allocate it until the July.
Right. It's not something the ATO is going to be knocking on your door for. No,
exactly. In fact, there's a special form for it on the ATO website for people who have employed the strategy. So it's because from a reporting perspective, when you lodge your SMSF annual return, it'll look like you've put all the contribution in and it all counts towards this year's or 22-23 year cap. It'll look like you're going to have an excess. So fill out a special form, tell them you've employed the strategy. push that contribution to next year, and they went not to issue the excess.
Right. Can you also maybe give us some examples that kind of highlight the enhanced flexibility that are offered by SMSFs and compared to, the standard industry funds?
Yeah, I think, historically, SMSFs were operated very differently to say, industry funds because of their investments. The menu of investment options in an industry fund used to be quite limited, but they've come a long way these days. So often, from an investment perspective, there's not a lot of difference between SMSFs and non-SMSFs, unless you wanted to do the business real property or, any type of property, particularly the odd assets, those sorts of things. But there's lots of other areas where the flexibility of an SMSF is really obvious, and pensions is one of them. Legally, an SMSF pension is just the same as a, mainstream pension paid from a large fund, but it's the way that they're practically run that makes the difference, because even when you start a pension, we move money from accumulation phase to pension phase. And in SMSF, that's just accounting work. We don't actually move assets. We don't open new bank accounts. We do accounting entries, and we make sure that the trustee's decision to commence this pension is well documented. In an industry fund, there's lots of moving monies, those sorts of things. Even just from the point of view of the greater control over your actual pension payments. In an SMSF, the members got control as to whether they want regular monthly payments, do they want annual payment? Do they just want to take ad hoc payments throughout the year? Some of the large funds don't offer that sort of flexibility. Even the where you pay the money to. So, for example, you might have an SMSF member who directs the trustee to make their pension payments into an account that's not in their name. So it might be that they want to set up a transfer of their pension payments into a savings account they've established for their grandchildren. That's perfectly legal, just not well accommodated for in a large fund. They've got to put guardrails on things to minimise their risk, so they don't allow for that sort of thing. But you can do that in an SMSF. Yeah.
Right. So those are a couple of the reasons that it's good to be in an SMSF, some of the additional flexibility, some of the different things you can do structure-wise. What about some of the indicators that someone might not be suitable for an SMSF, things that just might kind of send up a bit of a warning that they probably aren't right for this kind of superannuation system?
Yeah. Look, don't get me wrong. SMSFs are my world. I live and breathe SMSFs. But you can have clients that an SMSF is just not appropriate for. SMSFs comes with responsibilities. Being the trustee of an SMSF has lots of responsibilities. There's rules that we need to follow. So they're not appropriate for everyone. And, when trustees come unstuck, as I said before, usually it's because they didn't understand the rules. So maybe their financial literacy was poor. They often don't understand the two hats. They're both the trustee and the member, but they've got very, very different responsibilities. A client I'm working with at the moment doesn't understand that concept. It's all my money as far as he's concerned. And that just instantly leads to problems. So, if you've got a client, their business finances are a mess. They draw money from accounts without any regard for what that money's for, just expecting you as the accountant to work your magic at the end of the year and fix it all up, that sort of thing. That would be an indicator to me that maybe this person isn't good with following the rules. So if you were thinking that an SMSF might be appropriate for them, there might need to be some education first that, Fred, this is not one where we just, get to draw money willy-nilly. We've got some guardrails here. We need to understand separate responsibilities, rules that we need to follow, and very much ask before you do something so that you don't make a mess.
Yeah, I guess that education over making sure that they understand that it's not like other bank accounts that you can, you'll make it up later. We'll talk to the accountant. It's, there could be some real serious and very, financially damaging repercussions from these things.
That's right. And as I said, vast majority of them, they're innocent mistakes, but it doesn't mean that innocent mistakes don't get penalised.
Right.
So very conscious that they really need to understand what they're doing. As we say, that's where the professionals come in. So making sure that you've got that support network for them where they can read, they can learn about SMSFs, you're at the end of the line so they can ask questions to make sure that, is this okay? Am I allowed to do this? Those sorts of things.
Wonderful. Well, I think we'll wrap it up there. I think there's a lot of information that you've provided today that'll be very helpful. So thank you very much for joining us, Lyn.
Thank you for having me.
Not a problem. And we're back now with Aaron Dunn to wrap up what we spoke about this week. Aaron, what do you think was the biggest news of the week?
For me, I think, there was a lot of interesting content that came out of that SMSF Association Technical Summit. So, again, thinking through these $3 million issues is certainly top of mind for SMSF advisors. When the government keeps talking about these 80,000 people that are, potentially impacted of 0.5%, the reality is the significant majority are SMSF clients, and there's going to be much, much more than 80,000 that are impacted. So starting to think through the implications of these things, a lot of it is going to fall back to, well, once we have some draft legislation, we're going to be a little bit better advised about what we do and so forth. But the reality is our clients are aware of these issues, and they're therefore asking us about the steps that we need to be taking, and managing all those processes becoming crucial to appease clients somewhat where relevant, and getting them to start their own thinking about what alternatives might look like to their circumstances. Because, superannuation has been the vehicle to be utilizing for long periods of time. And we've gone through phases where you could have unlimited sort of amounts in super, and then caps that got introduced in 2017 about, retirement phase. And then we've got another cap here. And therefore, while superannuation has been a great vehicle, we've also at points in time thought about what alternatives look like. And this is just another layer that now gets added into that conversation. But it provides a fantastic opportunity to keep that engagement going with clients, and, what the value of advice actually does mean to benefit those clients as well.
Absolutely. And with all these considerations, someone who's perhaps running an SMSF unadvised, they might not know what other structures they might want to move into. They might not know, what they want to focus on and whether it's a good idea for them. So, I know it's certainly the ethos of this podcast that people should get advice on these things.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, and the reality is, when we think about, and we spoke about Michelle Levy earlier in the session about, and the QAR stuff, there is going to be a real gap in getting that advice too. Now, whilst a lot of those clients are advised, there are also a lot of relationships that are set on, accountants, and the gap that exists with the limited advice framework and the fact that they were going to be included in the QAR, and nothing really transpired out of it. So so there's still, to me, a lot of unconnected dots sitting on the page when we think about what might need to occur with these clients with the $3 million stuff, just like it was in 2017 when, a lot of clients had to roll back to comply with the $1.6 million as the transfer balance cap was introduced at that point in time.
Absolutely. And so we move from, the technical summit from the SMSF Association to just a quick reminder about the SMSF Adviser Technical Strategy Day. As we've mentioned on the last couple of podcasts, Aaron is the MC for these events. We've got the Sydney event on the 17th of October, Brisbane on the 18th, and Melbourne on the 25th of October. If you're outside of those states, you can watch it online and still get all of the benefits of attending. So it's always a good thing to do.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great day. I can't recommend it enough. Yes, there's a little bit of bias in there as your MC for the event, but there are some fantastic speakers, genuine experts in their field. And the diversity, I think, of the fields of expertise is great as well. So you're not only hearing from technical experts from a strategy perspective, you're also hearing in a legal context, you're getting sort of actuarial backing in some of the work that gets done as well. And then you're hearing from the regulator to kind of finish the day too. So it's great value. And as Keith said, whether you are in Melbourne, Sydney or Brisbane, you can attend live, or you can sign up for the live stream as well. And you can go to the SMSF Adviser website and purchase your ticket there.
That's it.
Well, Keith, if anyone does have any questions or suggested speakers or topics, how can they get in contact with us?
Yes, they can get to us at editor@smsfadvisoronline.com.au, and they can send through anything that they'd like to hear from us.
Excellent. Well, thank you once again for joining us for this week's edition of the SMSF Adviser Show. Have a great rest of the week. We'll catch you soon. Bye for now.
The information featured in this podcast is general in nature and does not take into consideration your financial situation or individual needs and should not be relied upon. Before making any investment, insurance, tax, property or financial planning decision, you should consult a licensed professional who can advise whether your decision is appropriate for you. Guests appearing on this podcast may have a commercial relationship with the companies mentioned.